The remote was yanked from her hand. The screen went black before Helen Carter could even process what had just happened. Jason didn't shout, didn't slam anything. He simply stood there, eyes ice cold, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. "Get out of the living room. You don't have the right to sit here anymore." The words dropped into the room like a verdict that had been decided long ago. Helen didn't react immediately, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. This wasn't a passing burst of anger. It was the certainty of someone who believed he had control. The armchair by the window still held the warmth of her body, the place she had sat every evening for over a decade, watching the news, sipping tea, letting the aches in her bones slowly settle. Everything was still there, but their meaning had changed. Helen slowly lifted her gaze. It didn't stop on Jason. It drifted toward the kitchen. Emily stood there, both hands gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her fingers had turned pale. Their eyes met. Just one sentence. A single sentence would have been enough to change everything. "Mom, this is your house." But Emily lowered her head. Her silence wasn't loud, yet it weighed more than any insult. And in that moment, something inside Helen didn't shatter, didn't scream. It went still, terrifyingly still. Jason walked past her as if stepping over an object, sat down on the sofa Helen had paid for, turned on his phone, the noise flooding the room, as if she had already disappeared. In his world, Helen was no longer a person. She was something outdated, existing only because it hadn't been thrown away yet. Helen stood up. Her knee throbbed with pain, but she didn't stop. She walked past Jason without looking at him, without saying a word. Each step slow but decisive, as if she had walked this path in her mind hundreds of times. At the small table near the door, she reached for her keys. The cold metal touched her palm, real enough to pull her back to herself. Behind her, Jason let out a mocking laugh, his voice dripping with ridicule. "Don't forget your glasses." Helen didn't turn back. She paused at the door for a brief moment. Her eyes swept across the room. The crooked picture frame, the rug creased under careless steps, the small traces of a life she had quietly maintained for years. And then she realized something that didn't make her heart ache, only turn cold. It wasn't today that she was being forced out of her home. She had been leaving this place little by little over the past 5 years. Every time she stayed silent when she was disrespected. Every time she gave up a small corner. Every time she chose peace over truth. Jason didn't take her house from her. He simply stepped into the space she had left behind. Helen opened the door, not in anger, not in haste, but gently, like placing a final period at the end of a story that had gone on for far too long. The cool evening air flowed in, carrying the scent of jasmine and the dust of the road. The city of Austin kept moving. Cars passed by, lights stayed on. No one knew that in this very moment, a woman had just stepped out of her old life. Helen walked out and closed the door behind her. Inside, the sound of Jason's phone video continued, loud and meaningless. Outside, Helen stood still for a moment, not because she didn't know where to go, but because for the first time in years, she didn't have to ask anyone where she should go. She called a taxi. When it pulled up, the driver looked at her through the rearview mirror and asked, "Where to?" Helen looked straight ahead, her voice strangely calm, "A hotel near downtown." No trembling, no hesitation. The car moved. The streets passed by like scenes from a film she had once lived in but no longer belonged to. The yellow light stretched into glowing streaks, reflected in eyes that were slowly becoming clear again. Inside the car, Helen placed her hand on her handbag. Inside was an old leather folder. It had been sitting there for years, just like she had stayed silent. But tonight, everything had changed. Her fingers tightened slightly, not out of fear, but because something else was returning, something she had forgotten she once had. In the small hotel room, Helen sat at the table by the window. The yellow light fell across her face, highlighting the lines of time, but also revealing something else. Her eyes were no longer the same. She opened the leather folder. The papers lay neatly inside, aligned, cold, precise. No emotion, no bias, no lies. Helen turned each page. Every page was a piece of the past, a piece of who she used to be before becoming the silent woman in her own home. Before all of this, Helen Carter had been someone people turned to when they needed the truth. 30 years working with real estate records, 30 years reading the lines others overlooked, 30 years witnessing families fall apart because of a single misplaced signature. And she had learned one thing no one ever taught in words: emotions can change, people can betray, but documents do not. The final page rested beneath her hand. The owner's name was printed clearly, not blurred, not mistaken. Helen Carter, sole owner, no Jason, no Emily, no shared ownership of any kind. That house had never left her hands. She had simply forgotten she was still holding it. Helen sat there for a long time, no tears, no sighs. Then a faint smile appeared, not joy, but recognition. Jason could turn off the television. He could throw her out of the living room, but he had never owned that house. And tomorrow, he would learn the lesson she had taught others for 30 years. The truth does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who holds the evidence. Helen didn't sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because her mind had begun working again after years of being suppressed. The hotel room was quiet in a strange way. There were no heavy footsteps from Jason in the hallway, no television blaring through the night, no need to listen closely to sense the direction of someone's changing mood. There was only the steady hum of the air conditioner and the city lights filtering through the curtains. And in that silence, Helen began to remember. 5 years earlier, when Emily called, her voice tangled with worry and hope, Helen hadn't hesitated. Emily said Jason had just run into trouble at work, that they needed a temporary place to stay, just a few months until things settled down. Helen didn't ask many questions back then. She simply thought her daughter needed help, and she opened the door. The first few months passed peacefully. Jason behaved properly, even showing gratitude. He helped fix a few things around the house, spoke politely, always calling her Mom Helen with a measured smile. Emily seemed relieved, as if she had finally found something to lean on. Helen looked at the two of them and believed she had done the right thing. But the change didn't come all at once. It came little by little, so small no one noticed until it was too late. Jason began taking up more space in the living room. At first, it was just choosing what to watch on television. Then gradually, he was always the one holding the remote. Evenings when Helen wanted to watch the news became rare. No one said anything out loud, but everything had been rearranged into a new order. Helen clearly remembered the first time she considered speaking up. It was a quiet evening when Jason turned on something loud, and Helen gently asked if she could watch the news for half an hour. Jason didn't refuse directly. He just smiled and said the program was about to end, that she could wait a little. And Helen waited. That day she didn't get to watch the news, and the next day she didn't ask again. The changes kept building. A shelf was moved without anyone asking her. A spare key was made without her knowing. Bills started being handled by Jason for convenience. Emily always stood in the middle, but in truth, she stood still. She didn't oppose Jason, and she didn't defend her mother. She chose silence as a way to keep everything from falling apart. Helen didn't realize it at the time, but she had begun adjusting herself to fit into a space she actually owned. She spoke less. She moved more quietly. She chose different hours to use the living room. The house didn't change, but her place in it changed completely. That night in the hotel, Helen sat by the window, looking down at the street below. Strangers passed one another without knowing anything about each other's lives. And she wondered, if someone had looked into her house over the past 5 years, what would they have seen? A normal family. An elderly mother living with her daughter and son-in-law. No one would have seen the silences, the times she swallowed her words, the moments she convinced herself that everything would eventually be fine. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the house was still lit. Jason paced in the living room, his steps heavy, his anger clear. He didn't understand what had just happened. In his mind, Helen leaving was just an overreaction, an older woman hurt by a sentence, nothing more. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she set her bag down. She no longer saw the familiar image of her mother in that house, only an empty space, and that emptiness made it hard to breathe. "Don't you think you went too far?" she asked softly. Jason turned back, his gaze sharpening. "I just told the truth. This is our house now. Your mother needs to understand that." Emily didn't respond immediately. Part of her wanted to argue, but another part, The part that had grown used to staying silent pulled her down. She turned away, avoiding Jason's eyes, just as she had done for years. That night, they were in the same house, but neither of them felt at ease. Jason kept watching his phone, trying to regain a sense of control. Emily lay in bed, eyes wide open in the dark, for the first time questioning whether everything was really as fine as she had always believed. Meanwhile, Helen was still sitting in the hotel room, the leather folder open in front of her. The memories were no longer blurred. They arranged themselves into a clear, logical sequence, like the records she used to handle. She hadn't been pushed out of her life in a single day. She had left it little by little. And the most dangerous thing wasn't that Jason had taken over the space, it was that she had allowed it to happen. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to accept. When she opened them again, her gaze had changed. There was no more hesitation, no more self-doubt. There was only one thing left, clarity. And this time, she would not take another step back. The next morning arrived more slowly than usual, not because the sun rose later, but because Helen Carter was no longer awakened by old habits. There was no sound of doors slamming, no heavy footsteps moving through the hallway, no need to listen for what kind of mood Jason might be in today. There was only soft light slipping through the curtains and a stillness so deep she could hear her own thoughts. Helen sat up slowly, as if every movement was intentional. The hotel room was small, nothing familiar, yet it gave her something she had forgotten for a long time: control. No one was there to take over her space. No one was there to make her adjust herself. She walked to the table where the leather folder still lay open from the night before. The papers had not changed. They did not need sleep, did not need rest. The truth remained exactly where it was, waiting to be seen. Helen poured herself a glass of water, but did not drink right away. She stood there, looking at her name on the page, as if confirming something she had forgotten for years. Helen Carter, sole owner. Not once was, not in the past, but now. A memory returned suddenly, clearer than any dream. Her years working at the real estate records office, mornings that began with thick files, arguments between families, desperate eyes when the truth did not stand on their side. Back then, Helen was not the one who made decisions, but she was the one who held the key to the truth. A single line, a signature, a date, just one small detail could change someone's entire life. And she had seen it happen again and again. A man who swore the house was his until the records proved otherwise. A woman who believed her husband had left everything to her until the will was read. Tears, shouting, accusations, but the documents never wavered. They did not care who cried or who was angry. They simply told the truth. Helen had once been proud of that, of her ability to see through words and look directly at what was written, and somehow she had forgotten to apply that to her own life. She had believed in words, in promises, in silence as a sign of peace, while the truth had always been right in front of her, as clear as the lines on these pages. Helen sat down, pulling the chair closer to the table. She took out her phone and stared at her contacts for a long moment. There was a name she had not called in years: Robert Hayes. A man she had worked with in the past, not directly, but long enough to understand how he thought. He was a lawyer specializing in property disputes. They were not friends. There had been no personal conversations, but there was a mutual understanding between them. They both believed in the same thing. The truth did not need to be loud. Helen pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the other end, Robert was sitting in his office in front of a stack of unfinished documents. He glanced at his phone, saw the name, and frowned slightly, not because he did not recognize it, but because it had been so long. He answered. "Helen?" His voice was not surprised, but there was a trace of caution. "I need help," Helen said, calm, direct. Robert was silent for a second. He knew that tone. It was not the voice of someone asking for advice. It was the voice of someone who had already decided. "What happened?" Helen did not go into details. She did not talk about feelings or the insult. She simply stated the facts. "My son-in-law told me to leave the house. My daughter said nothing. They have been living there for years. No lease. No transfer of ownership. I want them out, legally." On the other end, Robert leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling for a moment as if organizing the information. "The house is still under your name?" "Only mine." No hesitation, no gap. Robert exhaled slowly. Then you don't need permission, he said. You just need to follow the process. Helen closed her eyes for a brief second, not out of relief, but because something had fallen back into place. When do we start? Today. Robert stood up and walked to the office window. Morning light reflected against the glass. He had handled hundreds of cases like this, but rarely had he heard such a calm voice from someone who had been pushed out. Do you know what this will do to your family? Helen opened her eyes. Her gaze did not change. My family changed a long time ago, she said. I was just the last to realize it. On the other side of the city, in the house Jason believed was his, everything continued as usual. He woke up late, walked into the living room, turned on the television without thinking. The armchair by the window was empty, but he did not notice. In Jason's mind, Helen would come back. People like her always came back. They got upset for a while, then gave in. That was how things always worked. He did not know that this time, that pattern had changed. And when the truth knocked on the door, it would not ask for permission. That morning, there was no knock on the door, no warning, no chance to prepare, just a man in a suit standing at the gate, holding a stack of papers, and a calmness that made everything more dangerous than any outburst of anger. Jason opened the door with his usual irritation. He hadn't even finished his coffee. His hair was still messy, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. When he saw the stranger, he frowned. What do you want? The man didn't step inside. He stood still, keeping just enough distance, his tone neutral to the point of coldness. I'm here to deliver legal documents. Jason let out a short laugh, a familiar reflex when he believed he was in control. Wrong house. No, the man replied without changing his expression. The recipient is Jason Miller. The smile on Jason's lips paused for a fraction of a second, very slight, but enough to form a crack. Behind him, Emily stepped out of the kitchen, stopping when she saw the scene at the door, a vague instinct making her heart beat faster. Jason, what's going on? The man extended the documents forward. Notice of termination of residency, effective in 30 days. The space seemed to tighten. Jason didn't take the papers immediately. He stared at the man as if looking long enough could make everything disappear. What kind of joke is this? This is not a joke, the man said. Please accept the documents. Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took the file. The papers weren't heavy, but in her hands they felt like something undeniable, something real. Jason snatched them from her and flipped through quickly, the words appearing cold, precise, leaving no room for argument. The owner's name, Helen Carter. The recipients, Jason Miller and Emily Miller. Jason read to the end. His expression changed, no longer confident, no longer in control. Something else surfaced. Something unfamiliar. Confusion. This has no value, he said quickly, his voice starting to rise. We live here. This is our house. The man didn't react. You have 30 days, he repeated. If you have questions, contact the attorney listed in the document. Jason stepped forward as if to push the man away from the gate. She can't do this. This is family. This is the law? The man replied. 3 words, but they landed like a door slamming shut. Emily stood still, looking down at the papers in Jason's hands. The words didn't change. They weren't affected by his voice. They weren't shaken by her emotions. In her mind, a question began to form. When did everything become like this? On the other side of the city, Helen was sitting in a small cafe near the hotel. She wasn't in a hurry, not checking her phone repeatedly, not waiting for a reaction. She stirred her coffee gently, the spoon touching the cup with a soft, steady sound. Her phone vibrated. Emily's name appeared. Helen looked at the screen for a moment. She knew this call would come, but she didn't answer right away. She let it ring once more. Then she picked up. What is it? Her voice was calm, without emotion. Mom, someone came. They said... Emily didn't finish. She didn't know what to call it, a notice or a declaration. Have you read it? Helen asked. Yes. But you can't. I can. Helen interrupted, her voice even, and I did. On the other end, Jason grabbed the phone. What the hell are you doing? He snapped. You think you can throw us out of the house? Helen looked out the window, people passing by, unaware of the argument happening through a phone. That is not your house, she said. A simple sentence, no emphasis, no anger, but it shattered everything. Jason laughed loudly, but the sound lacked certainty. We've lived here for 5 years. We have rights. Where do those rights come from? Helen asked. A pause, not long, but enough to expose something. Jason spoke quickly, more urgently. We're family, you can't just... I allowed it, Helen said, and I withdrew it. Emily heard that. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Allowed, withdrawn. 2 words she had never considered. Jason began speaking faster, louder, trying to regain control through volume. But this time it didn't work, because on the other end, Helen didn't react, didn't defend, didn't explain further, just silence. And in that silence, Jason realized something for the first time. He no longer held control in this conversation. Helen ended the call. She placed the phone on the table and took a sip of her coffee, the bitterness spreading, but not unpleasant. On the other side of the city, in the house Jason once believed was his, the space began to change, not because the furniture moved, but because the truth had entered. The change didn't come with shouting. It came with numbers disappearing from an account. And this time, Jason couldn't speak louder to deny it. Everything began in a very ordinary place. A checkout counter in a supermarket, white lights overhead, the steady sound of a barcode scanner, people lined up behind, patient but starting to grow restless. Emily stood there, her hands resting on a cart full of groceries, familiar items, milk, bread, a few discounted products, an ordinary life, or at least that was what she still believed. She handed her card to the cashier. The machine scanned, a short beep, then silence. The cashier looked at the screen, then back at Emily. Sorry, the card is declined. Emily blinked. Can you try again? The machine scanned once more, a second beep, still declined. The air around them began to shift. People behind them moved slightly, glances passed by, quick but enough to create pressure. Emily felt her throat go dry. She searched her wallet, pulled out another card. The result was exactly the same. Behind her, Jason exhaled sharply and stepped forward. Give it to me. He snatched the card and swiped it quickly, as if speed could change the outcome. Beep. Declined. Again. Jason froze for a second, very brief, but this time Emily saw it clearly. It's just a system issue, he said quickly, his tone sharper than necessary. Try again. The cashier shook her head slightly. It's not the system. The air grew heavy. There was no more room for denial. Emily pulled out her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the banking app. The screen loaded a little longer than usual, as if even it was hesitating. Then the numbers appeared. The balance had not changed, but the status had. Secondary card. Deactivated. Emily swallowed, a cold sensation running down her spine. She didn't need to ask to know who had done it. Jason looked at her phone screen, his face no longer calm. Something sharp began to show, not anger, but fear. Call her, he said, his voice low but urgent. Emily didn't respond right away, but she dialed the number. On the other end, Helen was sitting by the hotel window. She didn't look at her phone immediately when it vibrated. She knew this call would come, and she let it wait for a moment. Then she answered. What is it? Emily took a deep breath. Mom, the card isn't working. A brief silence, not from surprise, but from confirmation. I know. 2 words, calm, no explanation. Jason grabbed the phone. What are you doing? His voice rose, losing control. That's money for living, for food. You can't just cut it off like that. Helen looked out the window, daylight clear, hiding nothing. I'm not cutting it, she said. I'm simply stopping the supply. Jason let out a harsh laugh. You're trying to control us with money. No, Helen replied. I'm stopping the confusion between help and obligation. The sentence hung in the air, sharper than any insult. Jason began speaking faster, his voice more urgent, as if saying enough would change the truth. This is temporary. I told you, the investments are coming back. We just need more time. Helen didn't interrupt. She let him finish, familiar sentences, promises repeated over many years. When Jason stopped, Helen asked only one question. Where is the money, Jason? There was no immediate answer, only silence. But this time it wasn't avoidance. It was the silence of someone who had no answer. Emily looked at Jason. For the first time, she didn't see certainty in his eyes, only confusion. You said you were investing, she whispered. Jason turned to her, his voice sharp. You wouldn't understand. Then explain it, Helen said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it forced confrontation. Jason inhaled sharply, then spoke quickly. The market is down. Everyone is dealing with it. But it will come back. We just need more time. Whose time? Helen asked. A simple question, but it exposed everything. Emily looked down, pieces in her mind beginning to fall into place. The times Jason said things would be fine soon, the times bills were handled, the times she didn't ask further. Not because she fully believed, but because she didn't want to know the truth. Helen ended the call. No argument, no prolonging, just stopping at the right moment. In the supermarket, Jason stood still, the phone still in his hand. The people behind them began moving to other counters. The cashier looked away, as if not wanting to be part of this moment. Emily put some items back, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Jason clenched his hand. For the first time in years, he felt the ground beneath him was no longer steady. Not because someone pushed him, but because what he had been standing on was never his to begin with. The meeting room felt colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning, but because no one inside still held a sense of control. Jason walked in first, fast, forceful, as if speed could help him regain the upper hand. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie off center, his eyes red from a sleepless night. Behind him, Emily moved more slowly, both hands gripping her bag as if holding on to the only thing that still felt stable. Helen was already seated. She did not choose the center position. She sat at the head of the table, where she could see everything without moving. In front of her were only three things: documents, identification, and silence. Robert Hayes sat beside her, files aligned neatly, his pen placed parallel to the edge of the table. He did not look at Jason right away. He waited, always waiting for the other person to speak first. "Shall we begin?" Robert said, his voice even, without emotion. Jason pulled out a chair and sat down harder than necessary. "I don't see why we need this meeting. We live there. This is a family matter." Helen did not respond. She looked at him, not with anger, not with irritation, just looking, as if reading a document. Jason continued, his voice rising. "We have rights. There's something called possession rights. We've been living there openly long term. Everyone knows it's our house." A brief silence. Then Helen spoke. "You're referring to adverse possession." Jason smirked, as if he had gained an advantage. "Exactly. So you do understand." Helen nodded slightly. "I understand very well." She leaned forward just a little, just enough to shift the atmosphere in the room. "Adverse possession requires 3 conditions," she said. "The owner is unaware, there is no permission, and there is no payment from the owner." Each sentence was delivered slowly, clearly, impossible to misinterpret. "I lived in that house," she continued. "I allowed you to stay, and I paid all the expenses." Jason opened his mouth but couldn't respond immediately. A gap appeared, not because he didn't want to argue, but because he had nothing to argue with. Robert gently pushed the file forward. "Ownership has been confirmed. No lease agreement, no transfer of title. The notice has been properly delivered." Jason turned to Emily, his voice more urgent. "Say something. Tell them. This can't be happening." Emily looked down at the table. Her gaze rested on the documents. The words did not move, did not change, did not care about her feelings. "You said we were saving money," she whispered. Helen did not look at Jason. She looked at Emily. "Saving requires numbers," she said. She opened her file. The papers were placed on the table, aligned, precise. "This is what I found." Robert did not stop her. He knew at this moment the truth did not need a lawyer. Emily picked up the first page. Her eyes moved quickly, then slowed, then stopped. "What is this?" "Statements," Helen said. "Credit cards, personal loans, investment accounts." Jason shot to his feet, his hand slamming down on the table. "You have no right to look at those." "You used my address," Helen replied. "You used the family name." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the anger. Emily turned to the next page. The numbers appeared, not a balance, but debt. "Negative," she said softly. "All of it is negative." No one spoke for a second. Then Helen corrected, "Not nothing, but less than nothing." Jason stepped back, his shoulders dropped. For the first time, he did not try to maintain control. "It's temporary," he said, his voice weaker. "The market will recover." Helen looked straight at him. "And in the meantime, you use my house to wait." It was not a question, it was a conclusion. Jason did not answer. Emily placed the papers down. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else, realization. "You lied," she said. Jason turned to her, his voice sharp, trying to pull back what was lost. "I didn't lie. I just hid it," Helen said. The room fell silent. Helen stood up, slowly, deliberately. "The terms are clear," she said. 30 days, no extension, no exceptions." She looked at Jason. Any threatening or harassing contact will be documented. Then she turned to Emily. You have a choice. Emily looked up. You can continue believing a story, Helen said, or you can look at the truth. There was no pressure, no demand, only two paths. Robert closed the file. The meeting is over. Jason did not stand immediately. He sat there, staring at the table as if searching for a way to reverse everything. But there was no way. Because this time, no words were loud enough to cover the truth. Helen walked past him. As she passed, she paused for a second. You confused patience with permission, she said quietly. Then she left. The door closed behind her, softly but decisively, and for the first time, Jason understood that what he had just lost was not an argument, but all the control he had never truly had. Emily didn't leave the meeting room right away. She sat there for a few seconds after Helen had already gone, as if her body had not yet caught up with what her mind had just realized. Jason stood up first, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He walked quickly toward the door without looking back, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't face Emily's eyes at that moment. The door closed behind them, but the silence in the hallway felt even heavier than inside the meeting room. Do you believe her? Jason said, his voice low but tense. Emily didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly, each step as if it had to be weighed. The numbers on the papers were still flashing in her mind. Not a small mistake, not a temporary shortfall, but a gap so large it could not be filled with words. You didn't tell me the truth, she finally said. Jason stopped and turned sharply. I told you already. Things just got worse. Everyone goes through times like that. No, Emily shook her head. You didn't say everything was gone. The words gone fell from her lips heavily, as if she herself couldn't believe she was saying them. Jason stepped closer, his voice faster, more pressing. You're overreacting. This is just a phase. I have a plan. What plan? Emily asked, not raising her voice, not angry, but this time she didn't avoid it. Jason opened his mouth, then stopped. 1 second, 2 seconds, there was no answer. Emily looked straight at him, and in her eyes, for the first time, there was no blind trust left. Only a question that had not been answered. You used my mother's money, she said, to cover all of this. Jason turned away, his hand tightening. That's family. She has to help. Emily stood still. The sentence echoed in her mind, but this time it sounded different, no longer a reason but an excuse. Helping doesn't mean being taken advantage of, she said slowly. Jason let out a laugh, but it was no longer sharp. So, you're taking her side now? Emily didn't answer right away. She remembered the night before, the moment Helen stood at the door, waiting for a word from her. And she had stayed silent, not because she agreed with Jason, but because she was afraid everything would fall apart if she spoke. But everything had already fallen apart. Only today she could finally see the pieces. I'm standing on the side of the truth, she said. Jason stepped closer, his voice lowering, carrying a familiar edge of threat. You owe me. I've been here with you. I built this life. Emily looked around the hallway, white walls, closed doors. Nothing there belonged to Jason. No, she said. We were living in a story I never questioned. Jason exhaled hard. So what are you going to do now? Leave? The question hung in the air. It wasn't the first time it had appeared, but it was the first time Emily truly considered it. They left the building in silence. The sunlight outside was too bright, making everything clearer than she wanted. The parking lot was wide and empty, with nowhere to hide. Jason opened the car door, but Emily didn't get in. I need to think, she said. Jason turned back, impatient. Think about what? Everything is clear. She's destroying this family. Emily looked at him, and this time she looked carefully. Not the man she had chosen, but the man standing in front of her now. No, she said. My mother isn't destroying anything. A pause. Jason waited. Emily took a deep breath. She's just stopped covering it up. The sentence wasn't loud, but it cut through the last thing still holding them together. Jason turned away, opening the car door harder. Fine. He got in, shut the door, and didn't look back. The engine started, then the car drove off. Emily stayed where she was, alone. There was no one there to tell her what to do, no one there to pull her along, only silence. And in that silence, she began to hear her own thoughts. Her phone vibrated. Helen's name appeared. Emily looked at the screen, her hand no longer trembling. She answered. Are you okay? Helen asked. Her voice wasn't forceful, wasn't controlling, just asking. Emily looked at the road ahead, cars passing by, strangers walking, each going in their own direction. I don't know, she said honestly. A gentle pause. That's okay, Helen said. Not knowing is also a beginning. Emily closed her eyes for a second. I can't go back to how things were, she said. I'm not asking you to, Helen replied. I also don't want to depend anymore. Then don't. There was no long advice, no ready-made solution, only a door being opened. Emily opened her eyes, her gaze changed. I'll find my own place, she said. I'll take care of myself. On the other end, Helen didn't smile, but something softened in her voice. All right, she said, and this time you'll know where you stand. The call ended. Emily stood there for a moment longer, then she started walking, not fast, not slow, but every step belonged to her. And for the first time in many years, she wasn't following anyone. She was choosing her own path. Collapse does not happen in a single moment. It unfolds quietly, layer by layer, until there is nothing left to hold on to. And Jason began to realize that when no one was listening to him anymore. The next day, he made calls nonstop, not to Helen, but to everyone who might help him preserve the image he had built, colleagues, friends, even his superiors. He spoke quickly, spoke a lot, explained, blamed, turned himself into the victim in a story he no longer controlled. But this time, his words no longer worked. In the office, Jason stood in the open space, his phone pressed between his shoulder and ear, his voice tense. This is a misunderstanding, he said. My family is going through something, but it has nothing to do with work. On the other end, his manager's voice did not change. You sent an email to the entire team, he said, including clients. Jason fell silent for a second. He had not thought of that. In his anger, he had only wanted someone to take his side. But instead of controlling the story, he had spread it. We will review this, the voice continued. But you need to keep personal matters personal. The call ended. Jason stood still. The office was as noisy as usual, people still working, everything moving as it always had. But something had changed. The looks. No one said anything directly, but their glances lingered on him longer than usual. Conversations stopped when he walked closer. Silences appeared where there had once been laughter. He was no longer the one controlling the story. He had become part of it. On the other side of the city, Helen received a call from Robert. You should be prepared, he said. When the money stops, the reaction begins. Helen stood by the hotel window, sunlight falling across her hand. She was not surprised. What do you think they will do? Try to regain control, Robert replied. By any means they know. Helen gave a slight nod, though he could not see it. Then let them try. There was no worry in her voice, only readiness. That afternoon, Helen's phone kept vibrating. Messages from Jason, from Emily, long texts, questions, accusations. She did not respond immediately, not because she did not know what to say, but because for the first time she understood that silence was also a choice. And this time, silence was not weakness. It was a boundary. Jason called again, and this time, Helen answered. You're destroying everything, he said immediately, without greeting. Helen did not react. You're losing control, she said. A simple sentence, but it struck the exact point. I'm just trying to keep this family together, Jason replied, his voice rising. A family is not held together by dependence, Helen said. A pause followed. Jason had no answer. He only had emotion, and this time emotion was not enough. Somewhere else in the city, Emily was sitting on a bench in the park, her bag beside her, her phone in her hand, but she was not calling anyone. She had just signed a lease for a small apartment. Not perfect, not as comfortable as the old house, but it belonged to her. No one could take it away. No one could force her out. She looked down at the contract, her name there, clear, not hidden beneath any other name. A strange feeling appeared, not joy, but relief. Across the city, Jason stood inside the house he once called his. Helen was not there. The familiar silence he once took for granted was gone. There was only emptiness. He walked through the living room, the armchair still there, but this time it was no longer just an object. It had become a reminder. He had never truly had the right to be here. He had only been allowed. And that permission was over. Jason stopped in the middle of the room. There was nothing left to say louder, no one left to convince, only the truth. At the hotel, Helen sat down on the bed and placed her phone aside. The messages were still coming, but she did not open them. She looked into the space in front of her and realized something. When she stopped providing money, she did not just cut off dependence, she also cut off fear. There was nothing left they could take from her, nothing left she needed to hold on to. Control does not come from speaking the loudest. It comes from knowing when to stop. And this time, Helen did not just stop. She stepped away. Day 30 arrived without any announcement, no drama, no final call, just a short message appearing on Helen's phone as she sat in a small cafe outside the city. They are moving out. Helen read the message once, did not read it again. There was no need. She placed her phone down and took a sip of coffee. The familiar bitterness still there, but this time it was not heavy. There was nothing left to anticipate. Everything had already been decided. On the other side of the city, a moving truck was parked in front of the house, its back door wide open. Boxes were loaded in, not neatly, not carefully. Jason moved quickly, but without efficiency. Every action carried the urgency of someone trying to hold on to something already lost. He did not speak much anymore. No more confident statements, no more controlling tone. Only short, sharp commands that no one really wanted to hear. The movers worked in silence. They did not care about the story, only about time. Emily was not there. Her decision had separated her from this scene. Jason stood in the living room a little longer than necessary. The room grew emptier, and the traces left behind became more visible as the furniture disappeared. Scratches on the walls, lighter patches where paintings had once hung, deep marks pressed into the carpet. He looked around. For the first time, he did not see ownership, only something temporary. The armchair by the window was still there, untouched. It did not belong to him, and he knew that, even without anyone saying it. He turned away, taking nothing except what he could pack into boxes. By late morning, the door closed. The movers got into the truck. The engine started, then faded into the distance. The house fell silent. No footsteps, no television, no sound of occupation, only space, an emptiness that for the first time was not filled by someone else. Helen returned in the afternoon. She was not in a hurry, did not rush, did not prepare herself mentally. She simply drove back, as if returning to a familiar place. The gate opened quietly. Nothing in the way, no one standing there holding the key. She stepped inside. The air felt heavy, not because it was dirty, but because of what had accumulated over the years. Helen stood still in the living room. She did not speak, did not sigh, she simply looked. The room was wider, emptier, but also more real. She walked to the window and opened it. Outside air flowed in, carrying away dust and old smells. The curtains moved gently. She walked through each room, the kitchen empty, the bedroom, neat but cold, the hallway, quiet. There was no longer any sign of having to avoid anything, no longer the feeling of needing permission to exist in her own space. Helen rolled up her sleeves, not because she had to work, but because she wanted to. She brought out a bucket of water and began to clean the floor, the walls, each movement slow, steady, intentional. No one was watching, no one was judging, only her and the house. Every stain she wiped away was not just dust, but traces of the years she had stayed silent. The next day, a painter arrived. He asked, "What color would you like?" Helen did not think long. Light yellow. Not the old color, not what had been there before, something new, a beginning. By the afternoon, the walls had changed, the light reflected differently, the space felt warmer, lighter. Helen placed the armchair back under the window, in the same spot, but no longer with the same meaning. She set a small table beside it and placed a teapot on top. Then she sat down. No one walked in, no one took control, no one told her where she should go, only silence. And this time, the silence was no longer frightening. That evening, Helen turned on the television, the volume just enough, no need to lower it, no need to raise it to compete with anyone, just enough for her. She drank her tea and looked out the window. The lights outside were the same as before, but inside, everything had changed. Not because she had defeated someone, but because she had taken back something she had never truly lost, the right to exist in her own life. The house had not changed, but the person living in it had, and this time, no one could take that away from her. The silence returned, but this time it was not empty. It was full, and Helen realized that on a very ordinary afternoon, when a knock sounded at the door, soft, slow, with a sense of waiting. She knew who was standing outside before she opened it. Emily. She stood on the step, her hands clasped together, carrying no large bag, no old expectations, only herself, and a hesitation she had never allowed herself to show before. "May I come in?" Emily asked. Helen did not answer immediately, not to refuse, but to reset the place of the question. "As a guest," she said. Emily nodded. "Yes." The door opened. Emily stepped inside, slowly observing. The room had changed, not just the paint, not just the light, but the feeling. There was no longer that invisible pressure, no longer the tension she once thought was normal. She took a deep breath. The air felt different. "The house feels different," she said. "No," Helen replied. "The house is the same." She placed 2 cups of tea on the table. "The person living in it is different." Emily sat down, not choosing her usual spot. She waited for Helen's signal before sitting. A small detail, but it said everything. They did not speak right away, not rushing to fill the space with words, just sitting, just being present. Finally, Emily spoke. "I moved out." Helen gave a slight nod. "I know. It's a small apartment, not nice, but—" Emily paused, searching for the word. "It's mine." Helen looked at her. "How does that feel?" Emily thought for a second. "Hard." A faint smile passed across her face. "But clear." Helen nodded. Clarity always comes with responsibility. Emily looked down at her cup of tea. "I opened my own account." "Good. I pay my own rent." "Good. And for the first time," Emily looked up, "I know exactly how much I have." Helen said nothing, but her eyes softened. "I also met with a lawyer," Emily continued. A brief silence. "I'm filing for divorce." The sentence was not loud, not dramatic, but it ended something that had gone on for far too long. Helen did not react immediately, did not praise, did not ask more. She let the statement exist in the space. Then she said, "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "I'm not sure about the future, but I'm sure about this." Helen looked at her a little longer. "That's enough." Emily exhaled a long breath as if she had just something very heavy down. "I kept thinking," she said slowly, "if you hadn't cut the money, if you hadn't done all of this, I would never have left." Helen looked at her tea. "I know." Emily looked up. "You knew?" "I saw it a long time ago," Helen said. "You weren't being held by Jason. You were being held by convenience." There was no blame in her voice, only truth. Emily gave a small smile, not happy but real. "I thought I was protecting the family," she said. "You were protecting a story," Helen replied. A pause followed, but this time it was not heavy. It was clear. That evening, after Emily left, Helen stood alone in the living room, the soft yellow light around her, no noise, no intrusion. She held the remote control in her hand and looked at it for a moment, a small object with no real power, only a symbol. She turned on the television, the volume just enough, no need to adjust. Then she turned it off, not because anyone asked her to, but because she wanted to. She sat down in the armchair and looked out the window, the lights outside flickering, life continuing, indifferent to what had happened inside this house, and that was exactly what made it matter. Because for the first time, Helen did not need anyone else to confirm her existence. She knew it herself, and she chose it herself. Before going to bed, Helen stood in the middle of the room and looked around once more, not to check, but to remember. Then she said softly, like a conclusion, "Enough." The word no longer meant endurance, it meant clarity. If you have ever felt small in your own life, remember this. No one can take your place unless you step out of it yourself. And if you have ever stepped too far away, there is always a path back. But this time, you return not to endure, but to choose. If this story made you think, share what you feel. Where are you now, and what have you ever had to say enough to in your life? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stay. Because sometimes what changes a life is not a big event, but a very small decision, spoken at the right moment. If you've listened this far, then perhaps something in this story has touched you. Maybe you have stayed silent for too long, maybe you have given up too much, or maybe you are standing right in front of a decision you know you can no longer delay. Remember one simple thing. No one has the right to make you feel like you are unnecessary in your own life. If this story made you think, leave a comment. I want to know where you're watching from and what the biggest lesson you took away is. Don't forget to like and follow the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Because sometimes a story can help you clearly see what you have known for a long time but haven't dared to face. And who knows, next time, the story being told might be your own.